Hello everyone, my name is Ivan Morgunov. I'm founder of the Longaevus Technologies. It's a company that develops drugs for longevity and age-related diseases. And I'm starting a series of interviews with leaders of the longevity field. And today I have a special guest, Adam Gries. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Ivan. Great to be here.
Yeah, thank you for your time. And could you tell me a bit about your past? From where did you start, and your professional way, not only about the longevity field, but in general, about your background?
Yeah, happily. So my background is I was born in Israel. I lived there most of my life except 3 years in the US as a kid, hence my English. I had a tendency for languages. And I went back, I did, high school, military service, which is mandatory. And then I got a scholarship to study in the US, where I studied neuroscience, economics, and psychology, but I realized I want to become an entrepreneur. And so after that, I started building companies in mostly consumer tech, starting with a website to order food online, then building apps and games, which I sold a company that was doing that stuff in 2008, moved to the Bay Area from Boston, where I went to school. And then I built an indie game studio and apps. And I discovered that one of my superpowers was to create different growth mechanics in product. So I'm a self-taught software engineer, and as a keen student of psychology, I've always been curious about what motivates people, what gets them to do things online, et cetera. And I use that skill and interest to build out a variety of products, ultimately reaching about 80 million users on everything from photo apps to games, virtual currency-driven ecosystems, et cetera. And I sold that company in 2012. I raised capital for a company, venture-backed, in the edtech space, and I ran that for 5.5 years, and eventually sold it to a Japanese company. And then after that, I was involved with an e-commerce company, which we also sold in 2021. So my background was mostly tech. In most of the companies, I was the founding CEO, and my tendency was to focus on product and growth. But since I'm technical, I could also be involved in some of the other components. And I'll say one thing as kind of a parallel thread. I've always been interested in what makes us human. So what is the nature of consciousness? What is the nature of reality? And as part of that, I became a pretty committed Vipassana meditator when I was 23. Cool. And since then have done 6 10-day retreats and try to meditate quite regularly to investigate what this thing that we are is. And so it was pretty natural that when I heard about longevity, escape velocity, and this idea of, we could do something about aging and longevity, I really gravitated towards it because I thought, if we just let ourselves age and die, we're not going to figure out what this reality is all about. That would be a darn shame.
Yeah.
And besides that, if you just think from first principles about the world, it's clear that we hardly know anything. So one of the first things you learn in psychology, like in my first class in college, was, the professor brought a beer can to class, and he poured the beer, and he was drinking the beer, and he said, what is the color of this beer? And different kids in class said different things. And what he was trying to convey is that reality and perception is something which is mediated. It's mediated by our senses, it's mediated by our brain, but what is the objective reality? We have no way to interrogate that. You know what I mean? And so in that sense, that kind of thought has been with me for many years. This idea that humans were born into this world, and now I have 2 kids. So when you see a kid born into the world, it's like the kid doesn't know anything. It's like a tabula rasa, right? There's some inclinations that are genetic, of course, programmed, et cetera. But they ask you things like, what is this? How does the world work? Et cetera. They don't know that the earth is a sphere, or that it's hanging inside a void in the middle of this space. They don't know any of that. They don't know what the sun is, et cetera. You have to educate them about that. And everything you educate them about is basically just this layer that we've imposed, humans, with language and fiction on reality, right? It's like
stories.
Stories. And I've always been very interested in chemistry. That was my high school major. And it always struck me how interesting it is that, we have these names, right? Like oxygen, carbon, but these things, they're just names for phenomena which we can interrogate with these mediated mechanisms, but we don't know if there's like an actual thing in the true underlying reality. What is that thing that we call oxygen? What is that thing that we call carbon, et cetera? And yet we can manipulate our environment in such incredible ways just by using our imagination. And so that's been something that, you know, has been a thread in my life throughout. And longevity also was an interest, but I like to say I was hibernating. I was just like focusing on my career, trying to get more resources and climb Maslow's ladder, you could say.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned, I heard it before in your previous interviews, that you was inspired by talk of Aubrey in 2006, kind of. So, and it took for you all the way to COVID to stay, you know, silent about longevity, kind of.
Yeah,
and the question is, like, it happens with many people that they kind of support things, but they didn't do anything like for decades.
Yeah.
Why do you think it happened with you, like, and like how it could be changed about motivation? Actually, you learned it.
It's a great question. If I'm allowed to rephrase it, it has to do with this conversation around what makes somebody committed to longevity, or what makes somebody a vitalist. And there are different paths that we take.
Yeah.
So if you look at the paths, you could say, well, some people get to it because they have a near-death experience, and that kind of is the trigger that wakes them up.
Yeah.
Some people, they just from a very early age know that they want to live as long as possible and that aging is not good, et cetera, et cetera. Some people are in the lab working with biology and they see they can change biology, and then, you know, they suddenly realize, oh, wait a second, maybe I can change my biology.
Yeah.
Why should we tolerate something we don't want?
Yeah.
So I guess, and there are a few other cases which we could go through. There are, I think, 6 or 7 paths people take. But aside from a very small minority, of this very small minority, because most people never get to that point, most people have a trigger. And that trigger is often some sort of event or moment that causes them to reevaluate priorities and commit to something which is really not typical in society, and therefore very high friction to get to. And so I'd say that's the main issue, right? Like, how do you, when we look at that friction, how would we break it apart? So what is it composed of? So you're sitting there, you realize longevity is important.
Yeah.
You don't want to age and die. You think it's not good. You don't want your loved ones to age and die. And yet you haven't activated, right? And if you think about it kind of like as a chemical reaction, you have the activation level and the activation potential, and you need to cross that threshold to get over it and get active, right? Just like a reaction. And so what are the components that might block you in that barrier? I think one is it's so big that you don't know where to start. And it's very hard to get information about this that's credible. So who can I trust about what can we do about longevity? And I'm not a PhD in biology, so how could I do anything? Or, you know, these are stories we tell ourselves, yes, but they're also grounded in some natural fears. So I think they're very common stories we say. Now you could say these are excuses, but they're part of what makes up this wall, which blocks the activation. Another blocker is your financial circumstances. So some people, you know, they just need to make a living, or you could say life circumstances. They may be in a bad relationship, or they have an ailing parent, or some other situation. They may be in a country that's going through a war, or something like that. I mean, a lot of people, they're in those situations, and then exclude the people who may not have either the intellectual capacity or other capacities to even engage with this. You know, it's easy to self-select and be around people who are lucky to have been well educated and maybe won the genetic lottery, so they have a lot of kind of gifts, etc. But a lot of people are not in that position, and so for them it's an even higher wall, I think, to get active. So those are what I think were the things that held me back until this COVID situation.
Okay. So we're coming to the probably main topic of today and the main things that you're working on. So what is vitalism?
So vitalism is the revolutionary movement against biological aging and death, or you could say for unlimited lifespans and peak health, if you wanted to say it in the affirmative.
Yeah.
And the idea behind it is that humanity should fight hard to be alive and well. I mean, this might seem like just simple common sense. Like, don't we want to be alive and well?
Yeah.
This is kind of something that I think if you just asked 100 people in the street, maybe 100 out of 100 would say, yeah, I want to be alive and well. And yet when you look at the resource allocation in our society and how we prioritize being alive and well, you quickly realize that we're actually not prioritizing at all because it's like we're selectively ignoring the elephant in the room, which is that humans are, you could say, condemned today to age, become decrepit, and then die. Each person, their loved ones, and our entire society is crafted around this reality in a way to accommodate that reality, but not to confront that reality. If we wanted to confront that reality, then our resources would be spent very differently. And I think that's the key insight behind vitalism, that we should try hard to be alive and well, and that the way we spend our resources in society should be representative of that. And if that's the case, we need some sort of revolution in how we think about things, like many revolutions of the past, right? Like in the past, you had the revolution in the Renaissance, where God used to be in the center and then man became, or the church and then man became in the center, right? And later you had an egalitarian revolution later. Oh, you know, initially only landowners had the right to vote, but then it was everybody. And then it was other groups who were disenfranchised, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think we're coming upon this new revolution. In a sense, I want to say we're lucky to have been born at a time where all the other problems have, quote unquote, been solved. So we are lucky enough that most people make it to old age, and most people die of old age, et cetera, et cetera. And so that is the necessary revolution of our time, I think of all time, but we're kind of in a privileged position that now more and more people are realizing it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so you mentioned like the previous paradigm shifts in the past, but we still have a few, let's say, movement already. Like, what differs you from, let's say, Zeroism or like Transhumanistic Party of the United States? It seems like it seems to be a bit similar. They want, like, you know, the one wants to bring a transhumanistic revolution, and like, Brian Johnson says that he works on people not dying. What differs with vitalism and why we need it?
Yeah, so I think that it depends on which movement. It's not kind of a wide brush that colors all the movements or all the philosophies. Vitalism is revolutionary in the, I would say, literal sense. So the idea being that we're saying something universally prescriptive about how society should spend its resources. And that's different than, for example, Zeroism, the way I understand it, or transhumanism. So transhumanism will say something like, okay, the way I understand it, humanity needs to evolve and move into this glorious future which celebrates acceleration of technology, improvement of different kind of circumstances, et cetera. And to do that with technology in a way that's very, let's say, open-minded, maybe personal augmentation, genetic engineering, things like that. But it doesn't have necessarily a revolutionary position. It doesn't say, oh, like, people who have influence in every government in the world should support this. In that sense, it's not revolutionary, right? So if you think about, for example, the women's suffrage movement, they had a kind of revolutionary idea, which is women should have equal rights. Not in one place, everywhere, just because it's the right thing that women should have equal rights. And so in the same way, the vitalist perspective is that aging should be something that societies prioritize to spend resources to address. Not just in one place, everywhere. It's a universal need, a universal human need. And so that's one difference. Another difference between vitalism and transhumanism is that transhumanism is very, let's say, inclined towards acceleration of technology and evolution, and vitalism is more conservative. It's not saying, hey, it's just as well if you upload my brain to the cloud as me staying alive. You know, and there's some transhumanists that would even say, oh, we want to move away from this biological body to something better so we can go to Alpha Centauri as soon as possible or something like that. And that's not the vitalist position. I think the vitalist position is more conservative. It's just like, look, humanity is great. It's not that we want to evolve away. And by the way, that's a difference with zeroism as well, right? Like Brian Johnson seems to have come from a place where he was really suffering and he wanted to move away from that suffering. And he talks about this a lot in interviews. He wanted to create an autonomous self that would make decisions for him so that he wouldn't make decisions that cause self-harm. And of course, you know, I celebrate his success at doing that, and it's wonderful that he's found a path that makes him really satisfied and happy, and he's contributing to a lot of other people too. That being said, there's a stress there on kind of delegating decisions to another agent, and there's a stress on kind of evolution. How do we evolve to be like the new humans, et cetera, et cetera? And the vitalist position is, I would say, more agnostic about that. We're just saying, hey, life is great. Life is great just the way it is. Just take the aging part out of it because we want to be healthy and well. Can't we all agree about that first? And so it's a much simpler, I think, ideology in that sense, which in a way is really much more mainstream and common sense. And I would also say, you know, when you think about some of these movements like transhumanism and others, some of them, you know, when I think about like the word transhumanism, it's hard for me to relate to it because it separates itself from humanism. It's a new thing or it's a different thing. And I think if we agree that being alive and well is just simple common sense, then that is humanism. I mean, if somebody told you like, oh, you know, it's like Hillary Clinton's famous phrase that she gave at one of these summits. She said, you know, women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights. You know what I mean? There's no difference between these things. Like, so it's just our mission as a humanitarian, it's the most humanitarian mission. And that's I think, the space in the conversation that we want to be in.
Yeah, what you're saying, it brings me to parallel with, let's say, communism and religious movements when they want to spread the idea, when they want it like, make it like to change, to move the world in this direction. Like that, it's not just internal, but it's external, comparing with zeroism when they just do it internally. They want to change themselves, but they don't want to repair the world around them.
I think there are different connotations there. I would actually use a different example, which also was, I would say, had, let's say, a mixed birth, which is liberalism. You know, the American Revolution. We don't want to be under some king. People should have individual rights to pursue their freedom and pursuit of happiness and equality. I mean, enshrined in the US Constitution. That was a big revolution, right? It was an ideological revolution, and it happened everywhere in the world afterwards. The French were inspired by the Americans, and then they had the French Revolution, and then there was an entire spring of nations in Europe, all as a result of this idea that individuals should have mastery over their own fate, and they deserve rights. And so, in that sense, I mean, it's a similar idea, right?
The thing is that if we speak about America, that I think fathers of the America, they would be shocked of what's going on now in America. I think
I'm
not sure because of all this like military involvements and like I don't know, like freedom of speech. It seems like we cannot speak. I wouldn't speak about America that much, but like let's speak about Israel also. Like some people like say, Israel maybe it's also a bad example. Let's speak about communists. It's all clear. That idea was not that bad initially, but the realization was quite bad.
Well, I mean, you know, it's very interesting, right? It's like this idea in communism is such a powerful idea in some way, right? And that's why it's sold so well. Like, can't things just be fair? You know, things should be more fair. We should be equal. You know what I mean? and the resource pie should be distributed in this kind of fair way. So I'm not sure if you mean what is the question, what is the implementation going to be of a vitalist ideology? I mean, you could say, by the way, that communism didn't work in a sense, right? The outcomes, and even China, you could say it's communist in name only today. I mean, it depends who you ask. But socialism did work, right? And a lot of the countries in Europe and in many other places would be unrecognizable to the people of 100 years ago in terms of the degree of the social safety net that they provide their citizens, and the fact that you can have unions and workers' rights are protected, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, they're cultural shifts and they express themselves in different ways. And I think vitalism will be expressed in different ways in different places.
I'll give some like other example like that. What just like I will go for religion. There was Jesus, and 1,000 years after was the Inquisition, Spanish Inquisition. That like I mean the realization was it's separate, and sometimes the ideas could get corrupted in the future as soon as it gets more power. How we can be protected from that in the future? When some, you know, popes take the power and start to burn people on the fire, like, I don't know, it's not seems religious in the future. And it's happened kind of with communism too, like they started like just to kill millions of people. Like when they took powers based on the, you know, ideas, but they never followed the ideas, these guys already.
Look, I think you're 100% right that ideas and movements get corrupted.
Yeah.
They have a tendency, and especially when they gain influence, to attract unscrupulous interests that will try to use the energies, to harness the energies in those movements for their own agendas, which may be corrupting agendas. So I can totally see that. That being said, there's a question around how solid the foundation of whatever fiction you're pursuing is. If you look at the foundation of America, there's something which is very resilient still in the American Constitution. And it's been around, you know, for 250 years, and it still has a lot of things that just touch something very basic about humanity and allow the US to be such a thriving and dynamic place. Still, you know, the largest immigrant country in the world with so much energy. I guess my point is, anything can be corrupt. Vitalism can be corrupted in the future. And it's up to us to set a foundation of ideas that just makes that somewhat harder. And ideally, and I think this may be a point that you're implying, a governance system which, you know, we're early on, so we're just starting to develop this, but figuring out where we draw certain lines. I'll give you some examples, by the way. So let's say there's some way to genetically engineer people to extend their lifespans. Should that be allowed?
From my side, definitely,
Okay. Should you be allowed to do it to your unborn child who didn't elect it?
From my side, definitely.
Okay. What about if you want to do something like create a clone of yourself?
For me,
would that be acceptable?
For me, it's completely acceptable. So.
These are, I think, complicated questions. I'll give you some other example. You know, in some countries in the world, you're not allowed to use fetal stem cells for research because they say this will encourage abortion, and abortion from those people's perspective is like killing the baby, or, you know, it crosses an unacceptable ethical line for them. I guess my point is that the future is going to become stranger and stranger in terms of how we can change things. And as we reach those forks in the road, I hope we're wise enough to create, and I'm working hard for us to be wise enough and to bring the right people to be involved to define ideas that will withstand some of those challenges.
It's actually I have this like metaphor about humanity, that we are kind of humans become so interconnected by internet, by flight connections and everything. So before, in the past 1,000 years ago, we were just separate. What's happening here in Central America, no one cared about Europe for hundreds of years, but now something like COVID happens today in China, tomorrow it's already in the US. Like some idea in Facebook, some post in Facebook happens in America today, tomorrow it's all around the world. And all these products, services, whatever. And for me, it's analogy here that humans become like a cells, separate cells that become connected so much that they become like a whole organism.
Yeah.
And what happens now in the world, from my side, that's like people still not feel themselves as one organism. They feel themselves like a separate organism, and they start to fight each other. And they it's like a different organs that fight each other for the resources of but it's already like complete body, like that it's become cancer.
Yeah.
And the thing is that it took evolutionary like long process. That many people died before they learned how to cure cancer.
Yeah.
But it's the same example, like many humanities should die before we manage to fix it. So the idea that like it's highly unlikely that we're going to be the first who will fix it, like and evaluate,
You mean fix aging?
Not aging,
or fix anything.
Fix anything like this entire conflicts. What we were like, we have a danger of die from nuclear war.
Sure.
Yeah,
sure.
and it's like it seems it's not like this kind of thing.
Well, I will say that if you think about the values of a set of ideas, then you look at vitalism. You'd say, well, vitalism by definition is peace-oriented.
Yeah, sure.
Because it cherishes life.
Yeah.
And you could imagine, by the way, other idea spaces that are less peace-oriented. For example, if I'm a hyper-nationalist and my chief identity is allegiance to some state, and that's kind of the fiction that I tell myself, I am an ultra-nationalist, insert name of state, then I may be much more prone to violence because my chief value is not the celebration of life and the cherishing of life. And so I do think ideas matter.
I hope it will be like it would work, So another thing that I wanted, but why you can just start a politician party like a German party for the biological research? We can just, start a party and use this relocation of resources with this, and it's like classical lobbying.
Yeah.
Why?
It's a good question. I think the strategy that you take to face a problem has to match the potential resources you can recruit versus the challenge. And so in this case, if you think about it in practice and you say, well, let's say we started some party, the Vitalist Party of America, for example, right? Or the Vitalist Party of Germany.
Yeah.
And we tried to run. There are a few questions that immediately come up. What is your platform outside of this allocation of resources in what is commonly thought of as the health category? Do you have a platform? So do we now have to develop positions on everything from sewage to nuclear plant, to army allocations, to educational policy outside of the things that we think are important in education? It's essentially a forcing function that would require us to lift many, many, many other things if we want to appeal to a broader audience. If we want to appeal to, let's say, a narrow audience, you could call them single-issue voters. And by the way, this is, of course, referring to democracies, right? Then you got to ask yourself, are there enough single-issue voters for whom the single issue is longevity or aging and health, et cetera? And our sense is the answer is no. There are not enough people for whom this is a sufficient motivator to cross into doing an action. And so that's just not going to work. And by the way, if you think about political parties and how they gain influence in constitutional democracies or other democracies, typically what you see is that if you have a party that has a particular interest, like the Greens. They care about the environment. And they have other platforms outside that too, but it's mostly about the environment. That's how they grew, I think. That's the way I understand it. When they get into a government, they first of all, they need to stay a political party long enough to have a shot at being in the government, because they might get some seats in parliament, but they're not in government, so they can't control anything. I mean, maybe they'll pass a law, but it's like, you know, pulling teeth to pass one law, maybe a small law, that doesn't make a lot of difference. And over time, they can get maybe some position of influence. But typically, like, are there any countries where the Greens are the majority party? Where they're the governing party? No, no countries. And the climate change movement and the green movement is a huge movement. I mean, some people estimate that climate change is attracting $640 billion of investment annually from all these places around the world. So when you look at that direct political party formation, it just seems like a poor fit for the kind of need and audience that we're looking at. You would have to have a wider platform, but I think that a wider platform just forces you to address a variety of other things, which I think the jury may be more out on. It's not clear which position is the best position. You know, you'd have to, even people in the longevity community would disagree about which position is the right position if you open up that set of other agenda items. Now, if you think about influence of culture, influence of politics, there are a lot of organizations that influence, right? Like the AARP, American Association of Retired People, has 38 million members, and it has revenues of $2 billion a year. The National Rifle Association has 5 million members and revenues of about $500 million a year. And those two groups are two of the most powerful, influential groups in the world in terms of setting public policy. So if your outcome is you want to influence public policy, it's not necessarily the best way to even form a political party. You might want to create something else. And so if our question is, what is the shortest path between input and the output, where the output needs to be, try doing more about aging and death, then we're just trying to be pragmatic and evaluate these things, and a political party just doesn't seem to be attractive.
So it's more like the story with the war of cancer, AIDS, right? It's more kind of things when just group of people, they just, you know.
Yeah, I mean, the Apollo project was something that came top down. The war on cancer, complicated. It came both bottoms up and top down. I think also, the war against AIDS and the solutions that were found there. And climate change was, I'd say, mostly bottoms up, but it depends how you look at it. So I think for us, the question was, what is the strategy? How can we get there? And we have a three-part strategy in Vitalism. One, unify the people who care about the same topic, this topic that matters to us. Two, amplify this ecosystem which cares about aging and death. So which cherishes life. And then step three, create influence. So that's the third component. How do we influence the environment and the resource allocation, whether it's in a special economic zone or through suggesting policy for better regulations or through convincing an entity like the NIH and other organizations that already invest, like pharma, in biomedical research, that aging is the root problem, that all these downstream problems, like which we call diseases, are coming from. And so we should be smarter about how we spend our resources. Those are the three components of our strategy.
Yeah, it's cool. Yeah, because you mentioned before, like on your website and like in your previous talks, that you would like to, that your goal is to allocate 1% of world GDP to fight aging.
Yes.
And recently I watched your talk for the LBF, and I really liked how you described like this step-by-step plan, how we can get it. So you showed it so real. Like, and I was thinking, hey, we're already partially doing it. It was so inspiring. Could you like briefly share your perspective on how we can get from this point where we now to the as inspiring point as 1% of world GDP spending on aging?
Sure. So, of course, the details could take us an entire hour. I'll try to give some concrete examples, which I think will articulate the point. And feel free to point me in whatever direction you want to drill down.
Yeah, sure.
So today we spend about $3 billion a year on efforts to address and solve aging. And I'm just going to limit this to speaking about aging because aging is the primary cause of suffering and death in the world. And so what is that composed of, that $3 billion? Well, there's some money coming from ultra high net worth individuals, billionaires or very wealthy people. It's not that big of an amount. There's some amount, so maybe it depends on the year. Sometimes it's a few hundred million, sometimes it's $1 billion, like Alto Slabs and Calico had these kind of bumper years where they got a lot, but then sometimes it's like a drought for years and they don't get very much from high net worth individuals. Then you have biomedical R&D, which is funded by the government. In the United States, that's about $350 million a year, depending more or less, give or take, from the NIH through the NIA, which has a budget of about 3 point something billion. So it's about 10% of the National Institute of Aging's budget actually goes to what we Vitalists would consider basic R&D in aging.
Yeah.
And then you can imagine, well, you know, maybe in the rest of the world combined, there's as much as in the US when you think about that. And then you have the private industry, all the companies, you know, maybe 150 companies that are doing something associated with longevity, like how much does that add up to, you know, maybe $500 million, depending on the year, et cetera, right? So if you think about increasing that, what could you do? Well, let's look at a few examples. So the House Appropriations Committee, which influences the budget of the NIH, has 17 members. If a few of those members decided that it's important to dedicate more capital towards aging within the NIA and wanted that to be a mandate, then it's plausible that the amount that goes to the NIA, to aging in the NIA, could maybe double or maybe a little more. So with that, so basically you're just reorganizing the pie. You're not really increasing the budget that much. By the way, the NIH's budget, which is about 60 billion today, in some years is increased by more than inflation. So in other words, if inflation is, let's say, 2%, the budget sometimes increases by as much as 4% or 5%. And if you look at the NIH website budget over time, the NIH budget on their website over time, it's just been growing and growing. And so you can imagine some of it is new funding, some of it is maybe reorganizing some existing funding, but that could maybe double or triple the amount going towards this purpose. Secondly, you may have heard of ARPA-H, ARPA Health, so DARPA is for health. So the idea there is to spend $3 billion, 30 projects, 100 million each. That's kind of a rough understanding that I have of this. Typically, and you see this, for example, in the Apollo project, for every dollar that you spend, you get about $7 to $14 in spillover effects in private industry innovation. And so how much of that 3 billion will actually go into things that matter for what we care about? Hard to say, but maybe 5% or 10%. I mean, let's be pretty pessimistic or realistic about it. But if you get a multiple of maybe 7x of those very innovative things, you could get to an extra billion. Then you have private industry. And as private industry shows more progress, and we are seeing some progress, it's painfully slow, but the more progress we see, the more investment you'll see there. So maybe it'll go from 500 million within 5 years to $1 billion or $1.5 billion. And then finally, ultra high net worth individuals, there are many other things we could talk about, but just to kind of think, how could we go from where we are now to, let's say, 10 billion a year? And then we'll talk about $1 trillion in a second. So there are 4 or 5 billionaires who are, I believe, very committed to this. And there are maybe another 20 billionaires who have invested anything into this category from a science and innovation perspective. That number of billionaires, 20, 30, represents about 0.5%, so 1 in 200 billionaires worldwide or so. It depends which resource you count on. Let's say maybe even 1% of billionaires. As we see these increasing secular pressures to solve aging. And what do I mean by secular pressures? What I mean is an aging population, an insolvent pension system in many countries in the world, a shrinking population, social media, which is creating huge mental health pressure for people to stay young for as long as possible, a booming anti-aging and Botox and you name it industry, and an asymptote in terms of our return on investment in trying to solve the diseases on their own. So we're putting more money and we're just not getting results. All of these things are like this pressure cooker, and they're creating more and more and more and more pressure that's causing people just invariably to start thinking, hey, maybe we should do something differently. Because, you know, aging, hey, it's a big problem. It's hurting us here and here and here and here and here. Outside of all these, outside of the ethical perspective of like, I don't want to lose my loved ones, and I personally don't want to be decrepit, etc. Completely unrelated to that. These are secular pressures, and they're growing very strongly. And that's why I don't think it's any accident that Brian Johnson and Don't Die, and David Sinclair and Lifespan, and Peter Attia and his version, I mean, he doesn't say that, you know, we should defeat death, but he says we should all live to 100, you know, we could all live to 100, centenarian Olympics, etc. Does it sound like a coincidence that all of this is starting to happen in the last 5 years? I just don't buy it. And so my assessment there is that it's likely that that number of 4 billionaires who are very committed might double or might triple. And who knows, maybe one of those billionaires is a mega billionaire. And then if you catch one of those whales, that might dramatically impact the funding. So that's how you can get to maybe 3 to 10x from where we are today. How do you get to $1 trillion? I think to do that, you really need a mental shift. So at the government level, you would need something like an Apollo project. The Apollo project got about $60 billion, and it lasted for about 10 years or so. You know, we're talking about tens of billions that need to be committed by the government per year, at least, probably more, maybe 30 to 80 billion per year by the US. This is just the US with the Apollo project. And then you have to assume that the rest of the world is another US. So 2x, whatever that number is. So let's imagine that number is as high as 80 billion. And how would that happen? You would actually have to have quite a few Congress people in the US and a president who is open to these ideas. And so there's a big question, how do we get there? But it's also, you know, the Apollo program, right? Did the US suddenly become like, change its system of government? Or like say, hey, now we don't do capitalism anymore? No, the Apollo program happened, and for 99% of Americans, it's as if nothing changed. They were living their lives, they were doing their jobs, they were going to college and all that stuff. And in the meanwhile, the government was pouring a lot of money there, and then 10 years later, there was a man on the moon, you know? So it is feasible to imagine that kind of investment without some sort of what you would think of as a political revolution of the, let's say, very disruptive kind, but more of a revolution, more like this women's suffrage movement, which is just like more of a change in priorities. That's on the government side. Now, imagine that you're getting a 7x multiple on that on the private side because of all the investment that moves, et cetera, et cetera. And then imagine what that does to high net worth individuals. And all of this combined would happen by definition, because if there's that much acceptance of this with regulatory changes that make it easier to speed up innovation. So those are some of the things that we think about a lot.
This is cool, This is so inspiring. But like, do you have in mind some specific milestones on your way, like for the future 10 years? Or you, like, do you have like, okay, in a year we achieve this and this?
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good question.
For 1 year, 5 year, and 10 year perspective, let's say.
Yeah, so there are already a variety of vitalist organizations. You know, vitalism is an ideology. It's not just one organization. There's Vitalism Foundation, which is, you know, trademark the name so we could protect it from people misusing it or stuff like that. But many organizations can be vitalist.
Like here, Vitalia.
Like here, like Vitalia, that's right. One organization is A4LI. And so they're a longevity lobbying organization, and due to the efforts of Dylan Livingston, who's been doing amazing job, have created a longevity caucus. So these are Congress people who already today say, hey, you know, they may not, they don't even need to worry about some of the more, let's say, long-term stuff, but they agree with the idea, the geroscience idea that, hey guys, like, let's not wait until people are sick. So like, solve the problem before it becomes a problem, right?
Yeah.
So these Congress people, I think, can all agree about that. And then I believe that in 5 years, if we unify our community and can amplify some of our influence as an ecosystem, we can get more and more elected officials and other people who can direct resources to align with us and thereby move the needle. So does it mean, for example, Ken Bogner, the state senator in Montana, who pushed through the right to try expansion, which allows any Montana doctor to prescribe any drug or device that passed phase 1 trials.
It's amazing.
With informed consent of the patient, but the patient doesn't have to be terminally ill, as opposed to any other state in the US. This is like a truly landmark change, and it was passed by one state senator. I mean, of course, he managed to rally the support, and there were other people who thought this was a good idea, and Montana is a particularly libertarian state, so they're more open-minded towards like, hey, yeah, we need to withdraw regulation, individuals to be able to judge what's good for them, etc. But my point in that is that Ken Bogner is now running for Congress at the federal level. He might get in the elections this year in November. So I think, and you know, the House of Representatives has elections every 2 years. So when you ask me, for example, about like some milestones, I would say that within 2 cycles, so not this November, that's this year, then another cycle would be in 2026, and then a third cycle would be in 2028. If you look at the US as one example, it would be great. I think a good milestone would be to have at least 5 congresspeople who are explicitly supportive of this agenda by 2026, in addition to the 5 who are already in the longevity caucus. So then we would have 10 congresspeople in the longevity caucus, 5 of whom are very supportive of some of these ideas. And I think that could already make quite a big difference. Like 10 congresspeople, you want to pass anything, like 10 votes make a big difference, right? And this is just looking at the US. If you look at, for example, Vitalia, which is also really an amazing initiative, could there be a variety of companies that have great solutions that would just take 10 years to get through let's say a more conservative regulatory regime, or a regulatory system which doesn't really understand how to grok it. So even if they have the best intentions to actually push it fast, they don't really know how to do it because, you know, a lot of regulation is about protecting people, not improving health. And it's not that anybody's malicious.
It's destroying people by protecting them.
You know, some people will level that criticism. It's this historical kind of outcome, right? You had infectious diseases. The US was like, hey, let's do something about these infectious diseases. And then you create like a whole system around it, and ultimately bureaucracy, and et cetera. So you could imagine in a place which has regulatory flexibility, now it's Prospera and Vitalia, but it might be other places in the world too, you could have some companies that get to market faster and then make a huge amount of money by offering something that works and that is good for people and safe faster. It's imaginable that that might happen. And if that happens, that would be a huge wake-up call for a lot of the rest of the world. And I think that kind of what I would call lucky break, if that happens, could really accelerate investment into this category. So I think within 5 years, I'd say a milestone would be that we get at least one lucky break like that, where something is delivered in a more regulatorily progressive regime, in a way that is safe and that is not harmful to people in any way, and produces a lot of economic value. If we get those 2 things as examples, I think we will have made good progress. But you know, I'll just say there are other jurisdictions too, and we could discuss all of them. But those are some examples.
Like human MVP, right? So we have an MVP on mice or other model animals, but we need a human MVP where we just really improved something and people could really see the difference.
Yes.
Yeah. So Also, we have a brilliant example with Saudi Arabia. What do you think worked there, like with this revolution?
Evolution.
Yeah, evolution. Yeah, and revolution with.
Yeah, I mean, you know.
So they spend more than 1% GDP, right?
No.
No? Okay.
No, it's an eighth of 1%.
Okay.
So they're committed to spend up to $1 billion a year, and Saudi GDP is about 800 billion a year.
Okay.
So it's an eighth of 1%, but it's all coming from the government.
Yeah.
So you could argue that the spillover effects of that eighth might actually bring it to as much as 1% of actual GDP, even though in this case, Saudi is investing all over the place. It's not going to just happen in Saudi. But yes, you're right. Like, you could imagine it being close to 1% of actual GDP impact, even if it's not just the cash. I don't know how the decision was made. And I think that'd be really interesting to discuss with people at Evolution. But Saudi is a monarchy. And so decisions are made in a centralized fashion. The way I would think about this is as part of the mounting pressure. So you're sitting in Saudi Arabia. You have, this incredible amount of money, and you don't know what to do with it. And you're asking yourself, what is the future? And, there's a compelling argument that, hey, aging, is a huge problem everywhere. And the medication and the medicine of the future will be rejuvenation oriented. And so if you get a head start in that category, that could be a strategic asset for a country. It could create jobs, it could create profit. Because ultimately, what's $1 billion for Saudi? I mean, I think they're spending hundreds of billions to build Neom, the city in the desert. So okay, let's not get ahead of ourselves. $1 billion for them maybe not that big of an investment. It's part of maybe a portfolio strategy, but I think it represents that kind of understanding that this is happening. And it's almost like a lucky break in the sense that somebody close to the powers that be in Saudi Arabia managed to make the case that this is a good way to utilize resources, and it just passed through. And it's a very bold initiative.
It could be example for other countries, like if they succeed with that, it could be inspire other people to get to this race.
Exactly. Like Singapore or other countries that are very, let's say, innovation oriented. If Evolution gets any wins, then that would be very material. But even if it doesn't get a quick win, the example they're setting makes it plausible that other countries will follow suit.
Okay. I have a couple more questions about vitalism.
Sure.
So before I interviewed Lawrence, and I didn't know that he founded VitaDAO. He always says just I'm Lawrence from VitaDAO. And on the website of Vitalism is written that they are founders like you and Nathan together. Why Vitalism needs founders, and what is their role here?
It's a good question.
What's the benefits between having founders and between not having?
It's a great question. If you look at historical movements that have succeeded, typically, it's hard for me to come up with an example where there weren't recognized founders. Whether it's the founding fathers of the American Revolution or founding fathers of other countries, Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore or others. And sometimes they didn't take the label founder, but they were recognized as the founder, and that's how people talked about them. You know what I mean? They didn't take that label themselves, other people gave it to them. But if you think about an organization, I think that having some people who are very committed to the mission and have an establishment gravity to them, maybe kind of like Vitalik also with Ethereum, is very helpful for the mission to stay consistent. Because otherwise, if everybody has the same weight, what can end up happening is mission drift. It's more likely, there's a risk of mission drift. And so that, a higher risk. So I think that's one utility.
In communism, and etc.
You could look at it like that. So that's one reason I think it's a good thing to have founders. It also creates like some clarity when presenting this externally, like who is speaking for the organizations. If you have some people who are founders, it doesn't have to be one person or two people. You could have 10 people or 20 or 100 founding members or you name it, but people who have some recognized role which can be communicated to the outside world. So that's how I think about it.
Yeah, it makes sense. So also, like, I like it. I don't remember where I saw it, but you mentioned on the website or somewhere else, ethical evolution.
Yes.
I really like that, but could you more explain from your perspective, what do you mean by ethical evolution?
Sure. So it has to do with what we were talking about before. The idea that in the past, man wasn't the center. And then if you look at the Renaissance, right, it was a movement to man is the center. And then not just man, but woman too. And then not just man and woman, but every race or nation. And then not just that, but giving more franchise and equity to people regardless of their wealth at birth or their circumstances. And so, and if you think, for example, about other groups that are typically disenfranchised and or have been in history, whether gay or the disabled or other groups, and the elderly too is a very disenfranchised group. Unfortunately, still, we have been on this arc of, you could say, evolution, which is spreading and enlarging the scope of rights. So if you think about this as a curve, right, you had some rights that were limited rights to limited people. And then you increase the pie, more people, but still limited rights. And then you increase the pie even further, and you say, not only more people, but more rights for everybody. And now we're at a point where we're increasing the pie in a very substantial way when we say the right to life doesn't have an asterisk, which says, but dying and aging are fine. We want to just remove that asterisk and say, no, the right to life is something that everybody should have. And it's something we should celebrate and cherish and work hard for because it's worth it. And that's what I would say is an ethical evolution and really a revolution. There were periodic revolutions that are ethical revolutions. And it's easy to kind of not see that, to just look at it as like, oh, it's some sort of, I don't know, political game or whatever it is. But I think ultimately, when you look at what anybody is doing and you drill down into why they're doing it, you'll find that they have an underlying philosophy that has a perspective about what are the rights and benefits that every human should be entitled to. And that's where I think Vitalism is trying to push forward this ethical evolution and ethical revolution.
Yeah, because actually before we spoke with Shimon and we touched the surface here, and he said that what all humans have in unique, that maybe they don't care about someone else's life, but they care about the life of their best friend or relative.
100%.
So it's a common, common good, that everyone has in common. So and it's so simple because everyone wants people whom we love live and be well-being.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's so simple. It's weird that people just don't realize it, how simple it is. That it's just my life, and people love it. Their well-being, their good feelings, and everything. And on the other hand, it's suffering.
Yes,
it's crazy. Yeah, thank you for sharing your thoughts on it. Also, I have a tricky, not a tricky question, but one that probably people don't ask. But do we have enemies? Who are our enemies? Is Elon Musk our enemy? Is Vladimir Putin our enemy? Is Joe Biden our enemy? Who are the enemies of vitalism?
Yeah. So my perspective on that is very clear. We don't have enemies. The way that I see movements as succeeding is through compassion. I don't think, there's this famous phrase, you don't convince anybody by criticizing them.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
Even if you thought it was the right thing, it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
So, ultimately, if you think about it, let's just imagine your brother or a cherished family member says, I want to die, and refuses something that would protect them, right? I mean, you might be frustrated.
Yeah.
You might be even angry.
Yeah.
But most of all, you should be compassionate towards them, because they're making a decision that's, in our mind, harming themselves and harming everybody around them. And so our job is to help people see that and elevate them compassionately to a place where they see life as something worth preserving and worth cherishing, and then spend more resources on that. And look, I'm not saying there aren't people who harm others in the world. Okay, I'm not trying to reinvent the justice system. Like, if somebody is antisocial or kills somebody or whatever, society needs to have a way to deal with that, right? So that's outside of our scope.
Yeah.
But when you think about specific people who just have a different position on this topic, I think they're not enemies. They're our sisters and brothers who we just have to share a better version of the world with, and hopefully show them that better way.
Yeah, just keep working hard every day on what we are doing, and
Yeah.
showing the progress there, and it's what convince everyone probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. As soon as you get to longevity escape velocity, what you would do when you reach it?
Well, I mean, I have a problem with that statement because it's funny, because I was inspired by Albert Gries' talk, and I think longevity escape velocity is a very interesting and compelling concept.
Yeah.
But the more I've gone into the space, the more I conclude that it is overly prescriptive about how things might happen.
Yeah.
Because this idea that for every year that goes by, we'll extend lifespans by at least a year, really kind of assumes some type of theory of how change will happen. And who knows if that's going to happen? It might be that it's just like one magic pill or one solution which unlocks, double the lifespan, and then we'll be stuck.
Yeah.
We'll be stuck for 1,000 years, and everybody will just die. I mean, that could absolutely happen. Yeah. So I guess I wonder, could you narrow that question in a way that articulates what
as soon as you solve the aging problem, what would you do?
Oh, I see. As soon as you solve the aging problem, part of me wants to say, study physics.
Okay.
I mean, I think the most noble or the most interesting thing to me, and everybody grows up differently with different values, etc., but what drives me is the pursuit of truth. And so, what is the truth about this reality? I mean, why are we here? What is this?
It's crazy, yeah.
Right now, I'm on a ticking timer. I can't afford to spend all my time just thinking about what is reality all day.
Yeah.
I'm about to start aging, and my parents are old. They need my help right now.
Yeah.
We're in crisis mode.
I'm dying, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't feel I can afford to do that, but those are the things that I think are most interesting. I mean, right? Is this when we say the word simulation, or I don't know, I mean, what is this, right? It's just like I was saying about my daughter. You sit there with your child and you tell them for the first time, we're living on this place. It's kind of like a rock, but it's like suspended in this void. And it's like, what's a void? And you're like, it's kind of just like emptiness. Just imagine explaining that to a 4 or 5-year-old child. Yeah, it's like this empty thing. It's like, how are we just floating there? It's like, wow, it's complicated to explain that, And then there's this sun, and I mean, it's so crazy. Reality is just unbelievable. How could you want to just opt out of staying around.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to understand. You know, life is incredible.
True. Yeah. Cool. So, okay, many different people with different background could watch this video. What help would you need? How people could help you? What can accelerate you?
Yeah. So thank you for asking. First of all, you can follow me on Twitter.
Yeah.
So it's just my full name, Adam Gries, ADAMGRIES. And you can go to vitalism.io and sign up with your email. It doesn't cost anything. You'll be signed up to Vitalism Foundation. You'll get emails. You'll be able to connect with other people who care about cherishing life and being healthy. And it would be great if you spread the word. Yeah. If you want to participate more.
Share this video.
Yeah, share this video, absolutely, with anybody who you think can benefit. And you can participate in Vitalism. So you can contribute to our working groups. You can join as a mobilise vitalist, which is a small financial commitment and then allows you a lot of access to things and many benefits also for your health. You don't have to do that. You can do that if you want to be more involved. And of course, you can do things like join a vitalist organization. And that could be anything like your company, Ivan, which is doing great work. And it could be A4LI, or you could come and help Vitalia. I mean, there are so many good initiatives. And in fact, that makes me think we should probably put together a list and just help people find those initiatives. So that's some homework for us.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thank you so much. I know that you you dedicate all your time to this point, to the longevity. You spend like all your time trying to accelerate it as much as possible. Thank you for what you're doing. It's extremely important, and please keep doing it until we get there.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.